in person on ground, and a lot of people, several pages worth of people on Zoom. So I think there's a total of 44 of us in this critical practice studio, which is going to be a 10-week critical look at designing, building, and collaborating. So there's a YouTube stream.
Yeah, the YouTube stream might be better. That's what we're might for.
So Scott sent the link through Canvas. So if you're not in person, you should be watching the YouTube feed, we have the microphone hooked up to it and the camera. And we set that up specifically for the people afar today. And also, you can ask questions through Zoom, but you should be watching the YouTube live feed. Scott sent the link through Canvas today. Okay. So carrying on, we have a number of things that we want to accomplish today as a first day of class. We're going to do a lot of the things that you normally do on the first day of class, looking at syllabus, talking about policies, but we're also going to do our best to frame how we're thinking about this studio and how we've set up a number of projects in the calendar in a way in which we hope we can accomplish something valuable by the end of the semester.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
We're going to do this organically, right? Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is welcome to Critical Practice. There is a legacy of this program, and we are being mindful of that legacy while trying something completely different. And one of the differences is trying to be a little more creative with the modalities we use to frame the course and to frame your work. And so this is going to come off as, like, if you ever watch the first version of a podcast you really love, or you ever tune into it, it's like all clumsy and weird and no one sounds the same, and right, the pilot, right, is always weird. This is it. Like, you're in the pilot, right? This is before like all the characters really know who they are, but it's a pilot that we think is compellingly framed, and we look forward to working with you on it. And so I just give that as a preface.
Is that for how bad I did the
Yeah, it's an apology. Like, Jim was like boring me. I almost fell asleep. So what happened? So it was interesting because I found as we were talking here, there are people up there, and then there's all these folks on the screen right there, and all of us were staring at the screen and ignoring the actual physical human beings, which was really interesting. Right, which is interesting. Krzysztof Ładysko had his Alien Staff project a long time ago. If you want to look it up on YouTube, it's quite interesting. A person would walk around with a TV on a staff, and there was a head in the TV that would talk to folks, right? And everyone would ignore the actual human being to talk to the person in the TV. And I think I saw a little bit of this happening. This kind of weird hybrid zone is what we're trying to actually engage critically and thoughtfully, because it's the zone in which all of us practice, right? And so we all have to find a way to productively navigate this realm. And so the studio is set up to, in that genre, in that vein. I don't know if you guys want to add anything about the kind of the format. Please.
Well, one thing that I would say too, the part of the pilot, the history, and Scott mentioned this, the history of critical practice is that LTU used to bring an outside practitioner in. And I think we started to question some of that. So we haven't introduced ourselves yet. Some of you guys know who we are, some of you may not. So rather than the first experience for a student at LTU to have in a graduate studio being taught by someone that flies in for a couple of days here and there and is not really connected to LTU, you've got the chair of architecture, Jim Stevens, the associate dean for the College of Architecture and Design, Scott Schall, Kristen Smith, professor of practice, and I'm Carl Dobman, the dean of the college. And so,
You guys slide over. You're half of Carl Dobman, dean of the college.
I don't have to sit in your lap.
this is what it's going to be like all semester. this is what it was like all afternoon. But there used to be a team of people supporting people that were flying in and doing all these types of things. We wanted to rethink this a little bit and both be accessible and engaged, and we're around for the summer and we're here and we wanted to do something. The other thing, and maybe I'll just disclose some of maybe the selfish motivations of what we're going to think about, is that, and we'll set this up more over the course of tonight about why we're doing some of these things, but what we're going to do, the final project, is that we're going to build a building in 1 week in the courtyard, and it's going to stay up for 1 year. And so it's a really ambitious approach, but we have, last count as of today before we started, 44 students in the class. And so part of this is there's a number of introductory exercises, but when it comes to that 1 week, when we're all together on campus, it's going to be like camp and construction and
It's like extreme
barbecue, right?
Bachelor meets, yeah. It's got a whole mix of
Yeah.
things there. There's a whole competition model that we're using where there's a Darwinian process of design that we're embracing here, which we'll learn a little bit more about. Actually, it's more like Survivor meets Extreme Home Makeover.
It's like band camp, but for architecture.
There it is.
That'd be good.
Yeah. Band camp
Yeah.
for architects. Could be spelled architect camp, but we're going to call it band camp for architects. It's more descriptive.
So what else do we need to do?
Well, I would say that
This is like the pre-setup to the setup.
Yeah, exactly. It was intentional too when we have folks coming in to our campus. We were saying what learning objectives need to be covered as a part of a natural architectural curriculum that are very difficult to cover if we're always remote, right? It seemed like having a moment where we all come together, let's really strategically cover those learning objectives that we really would have a difficult time covering anywhere else. And a lot of that was about collaboration, design build, fabrication, right? It's very difficult to kind of pull that off when you're in Geneva or Switzerland. Actually, it's the same, but wherever you might be located, I guess I want to go there. And so that was one of the thoughts, also kind of guiding our hands.
Well, and the old model was what, 3 weekends?
4 weekends, and it was 5 actually. It started as 5 weekends.
So for many of you that are further away, that old model would have probably not worked. So I think as the school evolves, as critical practice evolves, is this not working, or a second one?
That was the second one.
Okay, we're getting a second mic.
This is like one of those refinements, right? The second episode is kind of featured.
So the new model this year is that it's 1 week. So from Saturday night until Saturday night.
Yeah, 5 till 5.
That will
13th through 20th.
13th through the 20th. We're all going to be together. We're going to work. There's a benefit to being together, but for people that are away, it should work better for you than having to come multiple weekends.
Yeah, we think it's a more thoughtful and strategic model. And with that as an intro, perhaps we jump into
To the syllabus.
yeah, not the intro to the intro, but to the intro.
To the meta intro.
Yeah.
So, we titled this. Why don't you explain the title?
Oh, the building collaboration. Because we were having too much fun. The building collaboration piece it describes the intent of the studio, obviously, in several different ways. The goal is, many of you don't know each other, right? So some of you do. Some of you work together for a number of years. Others of you are quite new to this place, quite new to the culture of LTU and the way that we pursue architectural education. And so we felt it necessary to kind of admit that individuality in some cases, right, where you all have your own backgrounds, interests, things you were doing like the hour before you came into this room or into this Zoom space. And we want to greet that. We want to welcome that, and we want you to bring that into the conversation. And so we started, the studio will be structured initially as an individual work, as a kind of a 1 week plus charrette-style competition model project, which we'll talk more about in a second. And then from that, we will gradually begin to form teams of folk that have sympathetic research interests, sympathetic ideas about architecture, sympathetic ideas about fabrication or building, et cetera. And that will, over the course of the 10 weeks, gradually gather steam until we do have a singular effort around this build. And it's a really intensive 1-week build where 44 former individuals are now combined into a much more cohesive team of folk. And so the whole studio is set up around that idea of gradually building this kind of collaboration. As a part of that, we're going to have some self-assessment tools and some other things that we're going to ask you to take on very seriously so that we can make sure that these teams are well formed as a support for your efforts in the studio.
I just meant the pun.
Oh, and it's a pun.
So we have some slides. I don't know if I should talk there, or there, but we have slides tonight to talk about some of these things. But as a setup, and the syllabus is on Canvas, and so you guys can download it. There's a PDF there. But maybe a few ways to set this up would be talking about, well, we use Robin Evans' book, Translations from Drawing to Building, as a way to start this conversation. And it's one that I reference many, many times in the way that we talk about design, in that designers, so Robin Evans, teaching at an art school, starts to understand that there's a key difference between painters and sculptors and architects. And it's because the painters and the sculptors can operate directly on their material. The painter holds the paintbrush and paints on the canvas, whereas an architect ends up designing something, but everything that we do as an architect is mediated through some form of material or some type of construction. Typically, architects design things and contractors build those things. So that means that we have this separation between that direct contact that, say, other types of creative disciplines have. And this was one of the things that we wanted to think about with the construction and with the fact, like, how we design something and then how we start to think about translating that into a built construction. I think the other thing that we've talked a little bit about in terms of the studio is what I would say are what design build studios suffer from. And maybe you guys have had this experience before, or maybe you guys have seen it, is that when you build something, you sometimes lose the discursive nature of being able to talk about that or use it as a speculative tool, right? You build something and the final review is often like, there it is, we made it, like that's the thing. And so we want to be able to talk about how we speculate on building, that the thing that we build is going to be a proof of concept of something that there are other ideas included within it. And that there is research, that there are other types of things. And so there's a documentation phase. So part of the real outcome of the studio is the documentation of the thing that we build and other ways to talk about it, multiple narratives woven within that. And so we really do want to fight the literal aspect of the design build type of thing. Also, in terms of setting this up, there's a book that I came across a number of years ago called Creating Shapes in Civil and Naval Architecture, kind of cross-disciplinary thing. But it talks about the fact that architects and shipbuilders are some of the oldest professions in the world. And the issue is that because there's so much money and so much time and labor that goes into building something that's bigger than what you can build yourself, you have to think about labor. You have to think about specialization of the people that are involved in the site. And you also have to think about some forethought that comes before that, right? That you can't just show up. We can't have 44 people show up and then start thinking about what material we're going to build it out of, right? It would be a disaster. And so what we're really doing is simulating this aspect of how designers work, in that we're going to think about this. We're going to design this thing, but we're not just going to design it. We're going to design the process by which it's built. We're going to design the logistics that go into this. We're going to design how those materials arrive on the site, how they get staged, and how we make sure that we can build this really ambitious project in 1 week. So, I mean, obviously this is going to be working in teams. So much of what we're looking at is that our profession is driven by teamwork. Again, back to thinking about any major public work, any naval architecture or civil architecture. It's like there's a lot of people involved and there's teamwork as part of that. And so we want to think about teamwork as it relates to critical practice. And we want to be able to, like I said, not only design the thing, but also design the process and design the organization of the teams. And so how do you guys begin to organize your small teams? What types of work do you take on? What types of roles do you play within that? And that's an aspect of design as well. The culture that we create for that 1 week is something that will be designed. That's going to be part of our responsibility. As we can see, YouTube, Zoom, Mural, we'll show Mural in a few minutes as well. But these are really ubiquitous, inexpensive, and easy to use technologies that allow us to connect with one another. And so the profession of architecture now is one that's been completely changed by this globalization and by this ability to connect. And so again, with us trying to simulate innovative forms of practice, it includes, most people were not educated in an online environment. And so when I talk to people and they say, how can you teach studio online? And they're practicing architects, I look at them just as strangely as they look at me and I say, you're already working this way. And they say, yeah, you're right, right? Let me guess, you have a client that's out of state, you work with consultants that are somewhere else, you might have projects that are overseas. Do you share files with one another? Do you collaborate remotely? Do you use Skype or Zoom or BlueJeans or Google Hangouts? That's the way that we're thinking about the master's education here. It's one that accepts and maybe accelerates some of the things that we see happening in practice through different types of technologies. Yeah.
There's an experimental quality to this as well. As Carl mentioned, rattled off the technologies, right? When we sit in this room next year, or in a better room for this particular conversation, which is one of the edits I'm going to make, because I think this is held in a different space. But as we do this next year, he would rattle off a completely different list of platforms, right? And the year after that, another list, and a year after that, another list. And so this kind of this rapid pace of innovation that surrounds us as practitioners also is pushing against what it means to collaborate with one another and what we can pull off as we collaborate, what we can pull off remotely, what we have to actually be in space together, what we can do digitally, what we do by hand, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that open-ended experimentation is also going to color this studio, right? In terms of your executed work throughout the studio, but also in terms of the framework. Right? And so in a certain respect, like we came together as we worked out the structure of the studio and we put our best guess forward in terms of the structure of the studio and how we would create this effort that would build over time and the frameworks we'd put around it and all of that. And some of those things we're fairly certain we're right on. Some of these things we just put our best guess forward to say, like, this is the way it could reasonably work and let's test it and see. And so what I'd hope is that you would be eager to be a part of that experimentation, because we look at it as not experimentation that just serves the interest of a class, but experimentation that could begin to provide information to the field that we all want to kind of build into, right? And I think we all believe that. That's one of the reasons we all signed up to be a part of this class, is this kind of weird, perverse thing. Let's do an online design build class. Let's just think about that for a second, right? We're doing an online design build class, right? And I don't know how many examples there are of an online design build class, but I imagine it's a handful. And so I'm going to give over to Jim. I know.
Yeah, and I would say that a lot of design build practices are doing online design build practice all the time, as Carl alluded to earlier, where consultants and clients and even employees of the same company are working on projects remotely together. One of the readings you'll have eventually, which we haven't gotten to in our assignments yet, but when we start thinking about what is achievable, what we can do as a group of 44 people, what can we build as we consolidate down? Two of the things that I'm kind of excited in seeing play out and to watch everyone struggle with, including us, is thinking about how much certainty is in what we do. And so the idea that we have technologies now that allow us to essentially spend as much time ahead as we possibly can and to predetermine everything that we're doing, if we choose, to an exactitude to where we know for sure the day you arrive that we're going to be able to accomplish what we're doing. But the reality is, the practice of that is it's not always so clear. It's not as easy as saying, well, this is what we're going to make, and we have exactly this many parts, and it'll go up in exactly this amount of time. And so balancing how much we feel like is certain and how much we deal with kind of improvisation and tolerance with these things is going to be my prediction in doing design build in the past. That's going to be one of the greatest challenges, is to kind of know the limits of what we're doing, the limits of the technology, and the limits of the material that we're using ahead of time without actually having it collectively in our hands. And that'll be the tough thing, but I think there are strategies that you can use to kind of work through that. But as we build through these projects, it's something I imagine we'll be talking a lot about.
Yeah, and I'd say the last bit, which Jim sets up too, is just the fact that we point to CAD/CAM technologies. I mean, the ability to be able to design something digitally, but also to go directly from a file to the factory. This is starting to question long-held relationships and long-held responsibilities within our industry, where we design something and we can send it directly to the fabricator. That changes all of these relationships. And so I think we're looking at that. We don't know whether or not this thing will be digitally fabricated or not. There may be parts of it, there may be connections that are digitally fabricated, but we're gonna look at those things and understand it, because again, we're using this studio as a way to simulate what we think will become more and more commonplace if it's not already commonplace. And so it gives you an opportunity to think about how you might deploy these things in your future practice and what that might look like. So just kind of continuing through then the course meetings. So if you want to talk about, I mean, you started to a little bit. I think we're gonna, I mean, you guys see on banner, we're gonna meet on Monday evenings from 5:45 to 9:25. That will typically be with Mural and Zoom.
And that's going to change a bit. So as you do the math, right, within a studio environment such as this, we have 44 students, right? So you have a 30-minute session with each student. That's 22 hours of critique over the course of a week.
And I don't think we're doing that.
Right, and the half hour is even going to be shortchanging. Our hope is that would be shortchanging the nature of the work you're producing. We're hoping that the work is much more instigatory and critical, so as to demand more than a half hour conversation. And so what will happen is, as we start, we have earmarked that Monday as a synchronous meeting time. And likely what will occur is we will assign each team as we start to form teams starting week 2, and the teams will increase in scale. And then, of course, the work that we expect of those teams will also increase in scale. We'll set up a time where we just know, okay, team 1, which might be of 4 people. I think the first pairing is of 4. It goes from 1 to 4, does it not?
Well,
or somewhere
let's
like
just
that.
lay that out. So for the semester, it's going to start. The first project is individual.
44-1.
So there are 44 teams. The second project, there are 11 teams of 4. The third project is there are 4 teams of 11. And then the fourth project is 1 team of 44.
Right. And so what will happen in those meeting times is when we're at 11 teams of 4, we will have focused meetings during that time. And we might have to reach out to you to schedule other times as well in order to have a proper conversation. And we've talked about even dividing our time up so that each team meets with 2 of us. And then as we go to the teams of 11 there are 4 of them, at that point all 4 of us show up and spend an hour with each team and then moves on. But we've earmarked that time just so that there's some predictability in the frame within the class. We will talk about Mural in a little bit, so I won't go into that. Canvas, obviously, you guys mostly know what goes down in Canvas. We don't need to talk about that.
Room.
And we have earmarked a space. So many of you are remote, and that's fine, and you have your own space where you'll be working and conducting this work together. But for those that are here or that are within driving distance that want to have a place to call your own and to work as a team, we've allocated 219 for this purpose. And so you guys have that room at your disposal. Now, what we'd ask is we're going to be ripping down some walls in that room to make the space bigger. So it's a good thing. So the walls that are surrounding what was the Denso computer lab or that computer area are coming down. And so locate yourself to the other end of the studio. And those that don't know any of the words I'm saying, you will know your friends and colleagues are wonderful resources and can point you to the correct end of the room. Or if you see a hammer coming through a wall, go to the other end of the room. That's a good clue as well.
Run away.
Let's see, what else do we need to know? The courtyard itself will come into play. We all believe it's one of the most underutilized assets within the building. It's just got a wonderful relationship to the rest of campus. Right now, it's a place where we like to grow weeds. You know,
Say where we grow weed.
no, just weeds. That would actually be more productive use, and grass. And so instead, we're going to, and you're setting up a ritual, kind of a temple, a Shinto temple inspired ritual where every year something will be
supposed to have that slide,
erected.
wasn't I?
Yeah. And then the next year, the first act, so next year when we come together as a first act, it will be dismantling the last year's work,
Their work.
archiving your work, archiving the material, and then building anew. And that cycle will be repeated every year. Yeah, so I think it's all
So maybe just
within the framework.
course objectives. I mean, you guys can read these, you'll see them. Development of critical design thinking, development of teamwork skills, understanding thinking styles and interpersonal communication, development of graphic communication and speaking skills, understanding the effect of method and process on design outcomes, and the use and application of research in formal design. They're really kind of thoughtful, maybe also obvious things for a graduate design studio to be taking on those as issues. There's no required textbook. We will have readings probably for each assignment or maybe for each team. We'll see how that goes. The first assignment, there is a reading with that, and they're scanned and they're a PDF on Canvas. All the assignments will be served through Canvas. You can see, I don't know that we want to get into the breakdown or dates for these. Anybody want to go over the evaluation criteria?
That's Jim's purview.
It's mine? What? It's not mine.
So the question was, just for those of you out in the universe there, work 4 is where we all come together. That's absolutely true. Work 5 is this kind of critical dissemination of the work, the documentation and dissemination of the work. The exact format of that, I don't know if we've resolved it. We've resolved it. No, we know that. There's a template. I'm not talking graphically resolved. I'm talking in terms of the team or the work effort itself, like how that's going to be subdivided. We don't know that. We have a great deal of conviction to the 1 to 44, and which we already described, to the 44 to 1. But the goal is that there's one work or one set of works that we produce together.
Yeah, and I think it's in light of that, the work 5 should be your moment to graphically and through writing to be able to articulate what Carl mentioned earlier, that the project is more than, hey, we built that there's actually, there are ideas embedded in it, there's a critical conversation that can be had about it, and that's the moment where you can kind of clarify that and reflect upon what we've done for the summer.
And there may be other, right, what we build might just point to other projects, right? There may be other speculations that what we build is a proof of concept that something can happen, but it could be, this could be built in 5 other ways. Here's how we show that. This could be, the way that we built this wall system could also be a roof system. Here's how we show that and document that. So,
And that's why we're keeping it somewhat open-ended in terms of the critical dissemination of the work, is that I think that the nature of the work itself is going to shift how it's disseminated. There are some things we know. As an example, we've reserved one of our gallery spaces, the brick gallery space, which adjoins the courtyard for the purposes of sharing the work, so that when people come back after we've had our summertime fun, they have an idea of what the heck is in the courtyard and why it's there, right? That just makes sense. But in terms of how it would be disseminated on a website or how it might be disseminated using other channels that already exist, and like we do know that Blurb is something that we're going to tap into, right, as a kind of a format, as a way, but there are others that we might add to it, depending on the work and the provoking questions it asks.
But we're going to produce a book at the
We
end,
do know
too,
that.
so everyone can purchase that book at the end.
At the end, yeah, it's a great present.
And I will always disclose my selfish motivations. Like, I would love to have some of those books to be able to raise money to fund next year's critical practice, right, and get a sponsor. And so the work that you guys do, we'll use as a way to leverage to continue to build this.
And thank you for asking the question. I just want to reiterate to those of you out here, and I'm going to roll up to C. You can register your questions here in the chat, which is like right now in negative 3-point font, so it's really hard to see. But
one other thing that you'll notice in the syllabus, that there is an additional assignment after work 5, which is participation and team peer review. For those of you who that I see in the room who had me for ID 5, you may be a bit familiar with this, but we actually have 10% of your grade, which is obviously a full letter grade, which is about how you engaged in the studio, how much you participated. That's of course tied to not only your attendance, but how ready you are for studio and how you engage in the critiques. But obviously there's 44 students and there are 4 of us, and you're going to be working in groups, which sometimes can become little environments within themselves. And so we have an online peer review for every single project that you're in a team with. So you'll notice on the home page of Canvas, starting at work 2, there's the assignment, but next to the assignment is the peer review, and that's actually what amounts to a survey or a quiz online where you evaluate all of your peers. You indicate to us how much your colleagues contributed, how much they didn't contribute, and then if our observations as faculty align with what the majority of your teammates say, then your grade will be either lowered or, in many cases, go up. And so when I've done this method before, I would say there would be a handful of grades that were lowered because unanimously the group said that the person did not contribute, and we noticed that they were not engaged in critiques. We also, in many cases, found out that people were leading the group, sometimes to our surprise who they were, and those grades actually went up. And so you have a say in that process in the end, but that is a letter grade.
And it's not just in the end, because if you look at the course objectives and the key, that collaboration, working as a team, these are core components. And so accepting the first project, which is individual, all of the projects will have a piece of the grade that actually is used to register your contributions to the team.
And again at the end.
Right, and that will be something that we're observing, because it's fairly easy as we meet with each group to understand who is kind of pushing the agenda and who is kind of just traveling along. But also you guys knowing each other, knowing the work that's produced, are going to give us key insight into this. And so there'll be a number of opportunities to register that. And again, our hope is, we show it to you just so that we are being very transparent about how we're aligning the grades to the core objectives of the course, which is altogether fitting and proper. But at the end of the day, I think, our hope is that the work itself kind of pushes us in terms of the work being interesting, being rewarding, and this is why we're actually in the room together. That's why I'm here. I'm not getting a grade, but I'm here.
Okay, me? All right. And so moving on to the evaluation criteria, within each assignment brief that we issue, there will be objectives related to that assignment brief. But the criteria for evaluating whether you've met those objectives are outlined within the syllabus. So the first being thoroughness, or indicating the depth of exploration. And I think a lot of you have probably seen these in other studio courses. the research and exploration for opportunities, and evidence of rigorous application of research. That the work is informative or shows clear communication. Taking a clear position, I think, is super critical at the graduate level. That your work takes a position and communicates that in a clear and understandable way. I love this line: leaving the recipient with an increase in knowledge or the reduction of ignorance, which is something to always strive for. In everything you do, and that the work begins to show an organizational logic of components and some sort of arrangement as it begins to kind of resolve itself, right? And so those first three we are offered as kind of baseline factors for evaluation that all projects should achieve, and then the last two that projects are striving for, that are going beyond the baseline factors. So a project that's demonstrating synthesis demonstrates some sort of relevance, begins to consider subsystems, patterns, experiences, activities, and experiences again, apparently. Whoops. So not simply the adjacency of entities, but the combination of like and dislike constituent elements. Are we in the wrong page?
No, you're good.
Oh no, you're just seeing the
I'm seeing it.
experiences is worth
It's really
saying
important. Yeah.
twice.
There are different kinds of
Truly.
experiences. We were referencing both.
And the integration and avoidance of existing context, which I think will be obviously a critical component, particularly as we approach the build. And finally, evocativeness, or the significance of the project, that the work begins to take a provocative position and not just a baseline position, resulting in stimulating, insightful, and challenging to normative baseline practices. Beginning the deeper conversation, which I think Carl talked about, which is this begins to be a test for other things, and the overall effect is to invoke or rouse discussion. The proposal clearly exploited unseen opportunities rather than simply addressing an apparent problem. So I think, again, both of those things at graduate level work should be apparent, and that's, I think, summarizes the goal of the studios. And
Jump in before you go to the teamwork evaluation piece. You'll see hints of this that we leave you with in the assignments. So work one, which was just posted as an example, you're each given a very small set of things by which to share your work with us. You're allowed, for example, one of the pieces you're allowed are supporting images, which we'll talk about all of the documents you're allowed to share. The supporting images, in a lot of ways, are opportunity for you to set the groundwork, or the grounds for the argument for your proposal, right? And if you look at the concerns that Kristen just outlined, like the first three are really describing grounds. It's describing a non-frivolous act of architecture, an architecture that draws its strength from the world that's around it, that draws its strength from a logic, the intelligent and organized application of materials and processes, right? It responds to something. It draws its strength from that. And I would say that that's something that will be a concern for you the entire term. It doesn't mean that we don't get fanciful and weird and interesting, but that interest comes from that grounding. It's pulled out. It's not applied to it. And there's a real difference there. And so I think that these learning objectives that we've outlined for you and the kind of parameters of the studio set that up pretty clearly, that the idea of being evocative or being speculative, those are drawn from something, right? They don't occur in a vacuum. And so I would just read these carefully in your own time, and then make sure that you understand how those are registered within each assignment.
Well, maybe not in your own time or on your own timeline, but in the next couple days you should read the syllabus.
when we're done talking.
Soon.
And maybe, I don't know, say
Yeah,
read the syllabus.
Yeah, read the syllabus. We can fast forward.
Right.
Is there anything else that's
No.
super key?
No, fast forward.
Appendix.
Since everyone's a new,
We sort of covered most of it.
since everyone's a new graduate student, it's stated, I believe, in the syllabus, but it's more of a university policy. There is no D's, just so you know. So there's C and C minus, and then anything under a C minus is a failing grade. That's important to note, and that's a university policy, and I think it's based on the logic that if you don't at least achieve a C, you're not doing graduate work, so you were not acting as a graduate student, so you failed the class. And so that's important to know, because some people are like, oh, I've got a D, I'm good to go. It's no, you're not. Okay.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean a shifting of the expectations around grade, right?
No, it's
A
just-
C still means the same thing. It just means that below a C is not acceptable at a graduate level. Yeah, I think Carl's moving on to his show, Images That Inspire. Building collaboration.
69 slides, things that I like.
There it is.
I want to be able to see.
So, well, we pulled together some images and some concepts and some ways to talk about the studio. And so some of them are just maybe things that we find inspiring, but also hopefully to give you some conceptual background or some other ways to think about some of these things. So maybe to start with a quick provocation, and the faces that I'm looking at in Zoom, can you guys see the slides? No.
It's in YouTube, right?
It's you need to look at the slides because they should be on YouTube. Are they?
I'm seeing nods.
They're like slow, reluctant nods.
There's an emphatic nod.
Okay. So you guys can see the slides on YouTube? Okay. At least two people can. So
We have YouTube verification here.
no, they're looking at something else on YouTube.
I hope it's interesting.
So the provocation, I would say, as a way of thinking about maybe what we do or as it relates to our profession, is just really quickly like look at how quickly technology has evolved in the last couple of years. Say from a phone, and then I was at the Henry Ford Museum this weekend too, and there were much older phones that were there that were not cell phones. They had bells on them, and they were mechanical. But in a short period of time, like there's been a transformation in that technology. If we look at the automotive industry, which sometimes can be a good thing to do, sometimes can be a problematic industry to look at. But here's a Cadillac from the 50s and a more recent Cadillac, and that they're safer, they're more fuel efficient, they're looking at other types of technologies, so those things are happening. And so the real provocation comes when you look at, say, what's happened in construction in the last 200 years or 100 years. There's some minor things that are happening. So in the slide, it's probably hand-hewn lumber on the left-hand side and prefabricated trusses on the right-hand side, but still lumber, still putting things together in a similar way. So trying to think, how do we imagine construction as a productive area to think about with research?
Can I add just really quickly to that? Unless you think this is frivolous or whatnot, the automobile in 1920, in terms of cost, was I think 80% of the average American's income. Today, it represents 18% of the average American's income. The house was 34% of the average American's income. Today, it's 43% of the average American's income. And so there's a real financial cost as well as an environmental cost for our lack of productive, critical dialogue around how we actually build. And by the way, when we're saying building, the slides that Carl showed a moment ago, architects touch about 2% of houses, right now, right? Even though housing does consume an incredible amount of the planet's resources and are a big piece of the inefficiency that we're talking about. And also, I know that architects often, if you look at the car as an example, when you look at the car consuming 18% of the average American's income, that means more people will have cars. Well, then we shouldn't be scratching our heads when the U.S. government invests oodles of money in car infrastructure, which we've done over the last 50 years fairly well. We've invested a ton of money in supporting the automobile and setting up standards and all of these things that all support that industry. Why? Well, because they're becoming more and more accessible. Everyone has them, and now we all need them. And it can be, we have grounds to say everyone should have these things, whereas the housing industry doesn't enjoy that same support structure, one could argue.
Except one appreciates and the other one depreciates.
That's a huge right. That's a big deal. Yeah, but you are looking at also a rise of a non-owner class within housing, but that's also reflective within vehicles because of their depreciation, but it's also happening within housing, which actually starts to increase the rent cost, right? And so people that rent on a per month basis spend 300% of those who don't in some cities. And so there are real ramifications for families in the kind of reluctance of the field to advance.
And the next slide is one of the Model T plant. And so for those of you new to LTU, it has new meaning for me. It's a slide I've shown for many years as I talk about manufacturing and making. But LTU's first building was donated LTU was given the rights to use a building just on the other side of this building from Henry Ford for what at the time was Lawrence Institute of Technology. So our university plays a role in this landscape in Detroit, in manufacturing, and this just is incredible machine that we see here. And for me, there's also a reciprocity between the horizontal plane, which is one day's production of Model Ts, but also the Albert Kahn building, which is also thinking about manufacturing and also thinking about repetition and all of these other types of things. So they develop and they evolve together. And we see these types of things changing quickly as well. We, as a discipline, need to understand what it means to automate something and how do we do that. I think the robotics is something that's coming. They're getting cheaper and cheaper. We're going to see them deployed in all sorts of new ways in our fields in the matter of the next couple years. This says the same thing. So on one hand, anything that can be automated will be. Anything that can be made less expensive through that automation process, it'll happen. So, but at the top of this curve is creativity. And so there's what role do we play? What roles do we play within our profession? But then there are also other tasks that we'll see. A lot of discussion now about AI. I was at a meeting last summer, and a lighting designer said, if I could have an AI design all the emergency light fixtures in a building, I would absolutely do that, right? And there are things that we do every day. Door schedule, no problem. AI the crap out of that, right? Let me get onto something that's more valuable and more impactful. And so I think we can start to think about how labor plays a role in that. The way that we design something, who's going to make that? How do we understand the social ramifications of those things? And do we make those decisions? This is something that I came across maybe last year, but it's called Martek's Law. And it's the relationship that technology is always going to move faster than an organization. And so new tools emerge, but we don't always know how to integrate them into what we do. And so from some of my experiences, there are things that we could do from file to factory. We could build houses, but the pain point was actually the permitting process and the fact that we had to submit 2D drawings to a plan reviewer, right? We didn't need drawings to build the houses. We could do them directly from our files. And so we'll be looking at these things, and these are issues that you guys will need to address in your practices and in the way that you think about these things. This is the Robin Evans quote that we started talking about earlier today, but just that separation between what design does as a kind of forethought and the need to think about how that plays out. A few examples of these things, like historic or precedent examples that I find really exciting as it relates to making and thinking about making. So Louis Kahn said that form is the resultant thing, right? Form is the thing that you make, but design was all of those circumstantial conditions, right? The client, the site, the budget, the zoning. Really good architects must navigate those things. But I think the other thing that I would say is that if you only navigate those things, the industry will eat you alive, right? Because all you'll be doing is satisfying all of those criteria. And so part of what we want to do with some of this is to say, and I think Kristen talked about it in terms of the projects having to be evocative, right? That something has to stand out. I think what I'm always challenging designers to do is to think about your body of work, right? If you just wait for a client to come to you and you satisfy their needs, and the next client comes along and you satisfy their needs, you may not be left with anything at the end. I mean, maybe there's some happy clients, and that's good. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have that. But your body of work is just completely contingent on the fact that who picked up the phone and called you, right? How do you stake out territory with your work? How do you decide to go after projects and take them on? So I think there's a circumstantial aspect to what we do, but I think there also has to be a kind of projective aspect in that we need to own where we're pushing some things. Jim talked about or picked up some of this topic earlier that I would say would be a general notion of craft. And so Annie Albers talked about that design is often regarded as form imposed on material. And so instead, the way that she talks about it, and again, she's a textile artist, so it's very easy. She has direct contact with the material and with the textiles. So she can be open to some of these things, open to improvisation. And it's we have to look at some of this. We have to be careful about it because it's good to think about opportunities. It's good to be open to some of these things that happen. But if the building's getting built and that's not what you've agreed to with your client, you will get sued, right? And if we're not really going to improvise, I think, in the week that we come together, because we're going to have materials here, we're going to have things prefabricated, we're going to have things that are set, and so improvisation will manage what that improvisation might be. Wendell Berry talks about the great destructiveness of the industrial age, and that's a divorce between production and consumption. He's talking about it that most people don't know where their food comes from. I challenge architects to understand where the building materials come from. Who are the tradespeople? Where are they coming from that are on your site? These are things that you can be thinking about designing, and you can have agency in the design choices that you make will inform some of those things that happen downstream. This is a slide that I use over and over and over again. It's a comparison between a kimono and a French dress. And so on the left is a kimono, on the right is a French dress. And it's not that one of these is old and one of them is new. They're both, I think, from the mid-1700s. But the reason why that I hold it up is we see a direct impact of labor on these things. And I jokingly say, but I guess I'm not really joking when I say it, is that we tend to educate young designers to work really well in a second world economy, not in a first world economy. And the reason why I say that is that you guys tend to be cash poor and time rich. I've seen students whittle down a big piece of wood to get a small piece for their model rather than walk to the bookstore and buy one, right? And it's because if you're cash poor, but you have more labor than you have capital. And so what we see in this slide is the fact that the kimono, the silk that's on the left, is almost viewed as sacred. So what's black is there is scrap. That scrap is still usable for something else. It's not just thrown away. But in a first world economy, like we see on the right-hand side with the French dress, is that the tailor is someone whose time is valuable. The material is just rendered as scrap and as waste. And so these are ways that we're going to look at some of these things. How do we understand not only what we're designing, but also the scrap that's produced from that? What happens when the value of the labor exceeds that of the material? And so I use the same example when I talk about, say, thin shell structures in Mexico with Candela. It's really, really expensive to build thin shell concrete structures for us because you have to build the whole building out of formwork and scaffolding. But when labor's cheap and material's expensive, you optimize to have the thinnest shell possible. In the US, we build really clunky, heavy concrete structures because the labor is probably 60 to 80% of the construction cost, not the material, right? And so that distinction will make choices for us as we do things. Same thing here. For those of you that are close by, hopefully you've all been to the Henry Ford Museum and visited the only Dymaxion house that's there, the Buckminster Fuller project. It's a really interesting story in that he was putting out of work airplane builders to giving them a job to build houses. And so really kind of poetic story about using one type of labor to think about making a project. In the end, it wasn't funded and probably poorly managed and any number of things, but starting to think about who's building your project can change the thing that you're building. Back to that kind of circumstantial condition reference with Louis Kahn. So a few things to set this up. Kieran Timberlake did this book in 2004 called Refabricating Architecture. Hopefully you guys have seen it. If you haven't, it's a really quick read and it's worth checking out. It was funded by the AIA, by the Latrobe Prize. I think they got $100,000 to look at manufacturing and how that could change architecture. It's a good book. I think it's also, I think they think that architects have far more control over things than we actually do. And so it's an ambitious, speculative type of book, one that's worth thinking about. But again, contractors have a lot of control over these things. Here, just a comparison between, say, the automotive industry and being careful to look at one from an architect's perspective, right? There's one federal code that dictates automobiles. Every single building site in the US is different. I've worked on houses in the same block, and one backed up to a wildfire zone, the other one backed up to a creek, and there were different state agencies that we needed to work with, right? So there's neighborhood zoning, there's city zoning, there's building codes, sometimes by city. If you work in Chicago, there's a different building code in Chicago than there is in the state of Illinois. Every state has a different building code, right? So it's a really complicated process for us to navigate those things. So we still tend as architects to be local because you have those relationships, because you have those connections and you understand some of those legal issues. And look at how fragmented the industry is. I think there's between 500,000 and 700,000 contractors in the US. That's a lot of contractors. I think, I just looked this up, there's 100,000 architects practicing in the US at 20,000 firms, which means on average it's 5 people per firm. We know that there are some big firms and then there are small firms as well, but that's a really fragmented industry.
Before you go on, remember we talked about the proliferation of the automobile based upon the efficiencies in the manufacturing process, which drove down the costs, right, et cetera, et cetera. And then we scratch our head when the federal government and other entities make these large-scale investments. You're looking at 2 very large-scale investments, right? The establishment of a federal codification. And up here is actually not, the automobile industry is actually supported by the highway system, right? Which is an incredibly codified entity within our country, a huge cost, right? But the cost was valued, it was meant as worth it because so many people could be served by it because of the, again, tracking it back to the efficiencies of the manufacturing process, which allowed cars to proliferate. I'm not advocating for that level of proliferation or not that level of proliferation. I'm just making an offhanded remark that that doesn't just come into being, right? It's not flippant that we are going to, as a country, invest a ton of money in the highway system and the kind of universal standards which allow automobile manufacturers to operate at scale that we can't approach as a field because of all this localized, right, variance. Does that make sense? These things are all attached.
And it changes the way that we have to work as architects, as designers. A few excerpts from Kieran Timberlake, and so we can also post these slides on Canvas. The thought is that you'll be able to go back and find some of these things and reference them if it resonates with you. An interesting graph that they put together, which is transportation costs versus available materials. So in a kind of prehistoric age, you have the stone that's under your foot to work with. There is no trucking company, there's no Amazon, there's none of those things. You can't just have materials and products delivered to you. So you have very few materials that you work with, and they're local. Right? As transportation costs drop and logistics, you have opportunities for logistics, you have the availability of more materials. I add the other lines at the far right of the chart that I don't think transportation costs will continue to drop, infinitely so. And so what does that mean for what we're going to do? How do we begin to process materials? How do we begin to think about transforming what's close to us in order to get it to work for us? Right.
It'll be interesting how that graph changes as the semester progresses and we move from the remote operation, right, which has a certain value structure associated with it as we're distant from one another, but we have some time, et cetera, and then we arrive on site and we have 1 week, right, to do this thing. Like, I think that transportation and building material costs are going to fluctuate because time now is an additional cost, right? We become, maybe capital assumes less of a metric and our time becomes greater.
Well, we're going to have to make a decision. Like, we can't get that material here in time. Do you pay for the upgrade or for the premium delivery?
Exactly.
What do you cut out of the project?
Or do you sit in a corner and like hone down that thing, old school here?
And then there's a kind of range too. So thinking about construction on site versus prefabrication. And so I always make the point when I talk about, say, something like a 2x4, 2x4 is not a material, right? Wood is a material. A 2x4 is an industrialized product with standard sets of characteristics of standard sizes. So even on the far left of this is industrialized products. So all of the things that we're going to order are already processed before they get to us. But moving up in scale into larger and larger chunks, thinking about, say, panelizing something or larger prefabricated elements of something, right? There's a trade-off in terms of where you might build it. You're going to pay for transportation, but you may pay for less on site. These are actual statistics that I had from prefab housing that I was working on, that it cost us to do something on site 5 times more than it cost us to do it in the factory. So you can imagine the design process that's trying to figure out, well, why can't we put the siding on in the factory? Can you detail this for us to get it so that we can build this in the factory and ship it out from there, right? How do we think about how all those pieces come together? In that instance, for me, design had a huge amount of agency, because it wasn't just about what does this look like, but it was, if we can figure out how to get all of these things in place in the factory, that was saving us thousands, if not millions of dollars. We can see this is back to Kieran Timberlake looking at doing something, and we'll have to think about schedule, and so sequential versus simultaneous. If you think about, at least from my experience in housing, if the house can be built in a factory at the same time that the foundation is being built, then you can collapse the schedule. If you can't start the construction on the house until the foundation's done, and you can't start putting the windows in until the framing's done, and you can't do the inside until the outside's done, all of these things get kind of strung out, right? So we'll have to think about, we have 1 week to do something. We probably don't want to do things sequentially where 35 people are standing on the side waiting for the first 10 people to finish what they need to do before everyone else can spring into action. Right? Sounds stupid, but this is the way that we build buildings all the time. So putting these chunks together, it's one of the things that they advocate for in the book, looking at, say, different assemblies. Door frames become doors, doors become bathrooms, bathrooms become something else, that these things kind of scale up as they go together as chunks. A couple of drawings or a couple of ways of thinking about these things. On the left-hand side is the Lustron house from the 50s. And this amazing, and I always talk about this, but I think it's based on a photo of an airplane where they lay out all of the ammunition that will go into the bomber or the fighter on the tarmac, right? Here the Lustron house is laid out, all the parts on the tarmac. And on the right-hand side was a kind of all of the smart elements, all of the pieces that we were speccing from our Revit model. So this was our Revit library for a prefab house. The 2468 house by Morphosis, looking at all of the different parts pulled apart from one another. Really beautiful set of drawings as a kind of catalog, thinking about that. But I would also maybe say, while I love this, it also comes from a time when where there was nothing being built, right? So architects did amazing, beautiful drawings that were looking at ideas and trying to do things, but it was because there wasn't the work, right? And so I think our industry oscillates back and forth between being really busy and having no time to think speculatively about things because there's stuff to be built and people are hiring us and we can do things, versus taking a step back and doing it. And some of these drawings come out of that. And so I just think about also that provocation that if we can go directly from file to factory, where do we speculate? How do we think about things? Is the drawing dead, right? We've been having discussions within the school about potentially the death of the orthographic drawing. It's not a drawing that one uses to project ideas. It's instead a drawing that results from cutting something from a Revit model, right? And there's a craft to one, and there's an expediency and an output from the other. And so we're interested in tracking what does this mean for where we're heading. Another similar type of drawing, this was by Abacus Architects in Boston in the 90s. Progressive Architecture, which was a magazine that probably very few of you guys are aware of, but PA did a competition for a house. And so this was the firm that won that project, and these were some of their drawings. So the truck is included in the drawing and how that arrives on site and how the parts get unpacked. I think there's also, and this is part of, we will have a budget for what we're going to build this summer. And if we have a budget, we don't know what it is yet, and I'm not saying it's going to be a lot, but having a budget means that we can start to access people. And so this is just one example of a small mom and pop machine shop that I've worked with in the past. And we had a small project. And what's amazing about the ecosystem of all of the things that are built around Detroit is that you can kind of walk into one. You can enter into that system, right? You can't go to Ford and ask them to throw something on the F-150 line because you want to have something built. But all of the other people that are supplying, you can begin to interact with them, right? So this was just a piece of slate that we were building a table for a client, and we had it water jet cut. And they had a few minutes, and they threw the piece of slate on their water jet table, and they cut it for us, right? So a little bit of cash allows you access to enter into this ecosystem. On the other end of the spectrum, thinking about, say, work share maps. So this is the Joint Strike Fighter. There's an amazing, and maybe I'll pull it and we can leave it as a reference. Wired Magazine years ago talked about the development of this plane. That's one that deals with really, really pragmatic issues, right? This is a plane that can take off from an aircraft carrier. It can land vertically. It was built for every branch of the military. So all of a sudden there's a plane that had multiple performance criteria, right? If you're a bomber, you have to do one thing. If you're a fighter jet, you have to do another. If you have to support ground troops, you do another. The Joint Strike Fighter allowed all of those things to happen. So the design process is really amazing in thinking about it. But the work share map, different parts of the plane are built in different countries. And so think about those parts with the tolerances that have to come together. We toured a factory a year ago just in Sterling Heights or something like that, where they're like 1/1000th of an inch tolerance because they're shipping that chunk of the plane to Israel to have another piece bolted onto it, right? Those things have to fit together perfectly. So how do we test things? How do we imagine these things? Another example for me is Gaudi's hanging chain models, using the chain and weighting them and using gravity, basically building the whole thing upside down to then flip it over. So what's our test? With design build, it usually tends to be, I can stand on it and it doesn't collapse, right? I have a lot of friends who's built all these digital fabrication projects, and they're like, look, I can stand on top of it. Like this. Here's another good example, right? How do you test something to failure? This was the columns for the Johnson Wax Museum with Frank Lloyd Wright. So on the left-hand side is what it was designed to do. And there's just this like excitement for these things, right? Like, let's test it. Let's test it. Put all the sandbags up there. And they put all the sandbags up there and nothing happens. It's like, put more shit up there. Like, keep piling it up, right? They use all the sandbags they can find. It still doesn't fall down, and they get a bucket loader and they just start piling dirt on top of the thing until it finally collapses, right? So having to test something to understand what are its limits, how far can it go, how far can it span, how do we think about those performance criteria? And so we're going to have to develop ways for us to test what we're proposing and what we can do. And I think just that it stands up is probably not good enough. There are other ways to test these things virtually. There are a lot of examples in manufacturing, and there's probably a lot of examples in detailing things, that you draw these details, and they're amazing details, but no one can actually fit a wrench into the space. And so a lot of these were early kind of virtual models to put someone in the space. Can your hand actually get into that space to put that screw in there? And so ways of testing that, ways of, doing it once. I should have pulled another example. We did a 4-foot mock-up for something, and it was threaded rod, and it was 2 sides of this plastic material, and it was distorting, and we were like, oh, this is great. Okay, we scale it up, and we realized that the 4-foot model, we could reach in from all 4 sides, or the 4-foot prototype. When we scaled it up to 8 foot by 12 foot, we ended up drilling a whole bunch of 6-inch holes and perforating the surface, which were just for access for us to be able to get our hands inside, right? There was no way to access those things from the edges. And so those mistakes get made all the time. We're going to make some of those mistakes, hopefully before we all come together for that 1 week of construction. Other examples of just looking at how you test, putting the human in that space of fabrication and construction. The Nymaxian house, another example there, just looking at who's building it, thinking about the labor pool. So scaling this thing up to a really, really large scale, the Airbus A380, again, big chunks of the plane built in different countries. And so if we think about, I love it as an example for us, right? We have a few people in this room. We have people scattered all over the country, maybe all over the world in CritPracs. How do we come together? How do we make sure that these things work, right? Well, here's a really complicated example of a really big plane with parts built all across Europe, right? Here's the assembly plant. Here's one chunk on a barge being craned into place, or being moved, put on a barge. If anybody's seen photos of some of these things, there's a wing. Being driven down kind of really, really small streets in France to go from one plant to another plant. Like these are not designed to go on the road. Although, I mean, in Michigan, we always see these. Actually, there's some wings are being built, not these wings, but there are wings. I've passed a few wings on 96 recently. I have pictures. I should have brought those. But there's also of course. These guys are attending class while they're driving, so taking pictures is easy. There's also the windmill blades that we see kind of on the road. So those logistics about how do you get under an overpass, what are the turning radii of moving large chunks of different things. I mean, you can get a sense of the scale here. Moving it into the factory for bringing these different parts together. I mean, most buildings that you work on are probably smaller than that chunk from the airplane. So whether or not we say it's architecture or not, I think the scale certainly allows us to think about this thing in a different way. In the assembly plant. So then just a couple of slides thinking about the way that we design and the way that we think about things, and also maybe the relationship to the body. This is from the Willow Run plant where Ford was building cars, and then when World War II happened, they started building airplanes. what's amazing, if you look in the foreground, someone like these guys, and again, it's all guys there, because that's what happened at that time. They're all laying on top of the full-scale drawings and drawing them. So there's a kind of gestural quality to what's happening. You can see the weights. I mean, I could even talk about it in relationship to NURBS modeling, the weights that are there for the curve, and the way that's those handle points that you have in Illustrator, that you have when you draw things. This is the analog version of that. And again, just to maybe provoke some thought, this is the iPhone 6, which is like ancient. You guys have probably never even seen an iPhone 6. It's 32,000 times faster than the best computer that put someone on the moon, right? That's in your pocket right now. So what are we doing with this technology? How are we thinking about some of these things? What's happening with it? Yeah, what are you guys doing? Just Instagramming all the time. Here's a nice progression that I like. So the thing on the left is called a map. You guys probably also have not seen these things. There's no blue dot that moves as you move around on them. They're a static thing. It doesn't rotate. It doesn't, you can't pinch and zoom it. And actually the thing on the left is a triptych, which AAA, weeks before you decided to go on a trip, you would call AAA, and they would pull all of these maps for you and bind them into a specific thing for that specific trip. And they would highlight them, that's right.
I can confirm through my mother they still make these.
Really? Yes. So the reason why I do it is just to think about what we have available to us in terms of technology. So that's a very static thing. In the middle is the Garmin, which has a map and it follows where you are, but it's not updated. So you might download that map and then you know where you're going. Right now, it's like if there's a cop that pulls someone over on the road, that pops up in Waze. If there's an accident, that pops up in Waze. If there's traffic, that's there. So how do these things translate from the way that we might think about drawings in a very static way to something that is constantly being updated, crowdsourced, right? That most of that data is coming from people that are driving ahead of you. So how do we think about what that might mean for the way that we draw things, for the way that we put some things together? Helsinki requires all new buildings to be simulated as part of their if you take BIM, they're talking about BIM at the scale of the city. So if you're going to build a new building, does that cast a shadow on your neighbor? What does that do to the energy? How does that change these things? Right? So how do we use some of these tools to do some of these things? This was the guy that was supposed to come who was sick for our panel discussion in BIM, but talking about Internet of Things. So he's designing factories. And what typically happens, and this is the case for everything that we do, right? We do a set of drawings. Once the building gets built, we don't care about the drawings anymore because the building's built. He's got a relationship between his BIM model and what's happening in the factory. It's giving the model real-time feedback. He can make a change, say in a conveyor belt or the way that something's positioned, and he said rather than let that thing built last for a year, he can get a year's worth of data off of the digital model in a matter of minutes. So if the person that runs that factory wants to make a change, they can simulate that, and it's back and forth, right? Is the factory performing like the model said it would? They're getting feedback. So there's evidence-based design. With Internet of Things, the sensors are getting cheaper and cheaper, and they can be embedded in all sorts of things, right? But there's new ethical questions that come with this. If you embed sensors in a bridge and the concrete starts cracking, at what point do you decide to not let people pass over the bridge? Right? In the past, we didn't know that those cracks might be happening. And so you just keep driving over it until the bridge collapses, right? At which point, like where is that kind of strain in the curve that says, okay, we need to stop doing that, right? Now that responsibility, if we have that knowledge, we have to think about that responsibility. maybe just the Laurie Olin quote at the bottom, drawing is an act of thinking. If you can't draw something, you probably can't make it. And I don't think that's necessarily drawing. I think it's whether that's modeling, whether that's testing, whether that's prefabricating or building a mock-up. I think we have to think about what we're going to do. We shouldn't be surprised the week that we get together. I think the coolest thing is we build the building in like 2 hours and we can party for a week. We've all done these gallery installations where like you're slaving away in the gallery, you're hanging things because you designed this super complicated thing, and then someone else who's in the show with you like comes up, puts a nail on the wall, hangs a painting, and then leaves, and you're like, what? Like we did that to ourselves, right? We made that decision. So we shouldn't be surprised when it comes to that. Another example, Durer's alphabet from 1535. How do we describe things? Again, if designers have foresight and think about what's going to happen, how do we communicate that? So this, for me, is an example that I always use for, it's not computer code, but an analogy to a code, right? That text on the right describes step by step how to construct the letter E. You guys are going to have to communicate to one another how to build something. You might be working remotely. I'm looking at the Zoom people. You might have to communicate to someone that's here that needs to CNC cut something, right? How do you communicate that information? Traits in stone. There's an issue of what order. If you do something out of order, you've cut that piece of stone off. So what has to happen first? What has to happen second? How do we do that? And this is the thing that gets amped up, I think, in the fact that we're building something. Typically, our drawings, in terms of construction documents for architects, they only specify what. They don't specify how. How is in the realm of the contractor. The sequencing is the responsibility of the contractor. So these are things that we're going to have to think about, and they're opportunities for us to design. They become design decisions for us this summer. The Gilbreth's motion studies. So this grows up around Ford, around scientific management, thinking about manufacturing, but the body, right? Putting the human body in that space, how, and almost sadly thinking about the human body as a machine. How do you replicate movement? How do you make the human body more efficient? How do you do these tasks, right? And studying them. So they put these blinking LED lights taped onto a person, actually not LED lights, like incandescent lights.
Candles.
Right, looking at how the worker moves in the space. Actually, the right-hand example, and this is something related to construction, it's a mason moving a stack of bricks from one side to build a wall. And so anybody that's done construction before, all construction is moving stuff from one place to another place. And then where you put it is in the wrong place and you need to move it again, right? So you're just constantly moving material from one place to another and hoping that you get it closer and closer to the final place of where it needs to be, right? That's all you're doing the whole time. So we need to think about those things. IKEA, holding that up as maybe either really good instructions, sometimes incredibly frustrating instructions, depending on what you're building, but there's no words. I can remember being on a construction site years ago with a set of drawings, and it started to become really clear to me that the person reading the drawings didn't know how to read. And so how do you start to communicate some of these things? How do you start to, right, amazing craftsperson, but just didn't know how to read. So the notes that we had put on the drawing weren't sufficient for what needed to happen. What are you thinking about this in relationship to that, to the week that's coming?
I would say we've talked a little bit about the documentation of the site. Punching in the face. Well, sort of. We've talked about the importance of documenting the site. It will be critically important to think about the larger site, right? You'll be installing this thing on an immediate site to begin to kind of extend outwards of how are things getting there, where are they being staged, do they fit through that door, or or wherever you're trying to put them. So the context of site then becomes about those transportation issues that we're talking about. Where's material going to sit? Is it covered? Is it protected from rain? And these sorts of things. Can you get something from the fab lab or wherever you're making things to where it's going? So right. So then the context of site becomes much larger than this sort of this model of the immediate thing that you're acting on. It goes well beyond that immediacy, that you have to begin to think about the process and the making and that assembly and how that all works together.
And it's temporal as well, too.
Right.
Well, and that's one of the things I appreciate about IKEA, and keep it on this slide because I prefer it. But the IKEA, in a lot of ways, they've become a lot smarter over the last several decades, and their products are more stupid-proof now than they were, right? Where when you have a dresser drawer, you can flip it either way. You can't do it 90 degrees yet, but you can do it 180 degrees, and it's still fine, right? They've moved from several different parts that you can construct anything you want with a single Allen wrench, right? Even to the point where the lever for the tool is now separated. Like those refinements, I mean, they may sound trivial or whatnot, but when we get to the site and we have to coordinate 44 people building one thing in a very small area in a very short period of time, that kind of stupid proofing is valuable, in addition to the instruction manual, but just the devices. And there's a difference in that and the stupidity or non-intelligence embedded in a stud, as an example, as a product, right? The stud is a product of intentional stupidity in that it has certain things that it does well, but there's a belief that you can chop it and you could do these, you can make it can be a structure for a floor, for a wall, or for this or for that, right? IKEA's part, it's a dresser front. That's all it is. But you can flip it two different ways. So there's an intention embedded within it. So they're able to leverage the kind of the production process off-site, which is at a much more modest price point with a higher quality. But then they allow for the right amount of flexibility to be designed into the thing, whereas the stud doesn't have that same degree. Do you understand that? Okay. Should be facing there. I think I have a bias to the people in the room, and I think you maybe to the people in the
I'm trying to overcome it.
Yeah, we're both doing that.
There's also disassembly too. I can remember being so angry at one of my former employees because we built shelves in our office, and it came time that we needed to move them and take them apart. Phillips head screws, hex head screws, and square head screws in the same piece. So, right, you're like trying to unscrew something because you can't see it and you can't access it, and you strip the screw. But you're going to have the same problem. Like, can you guys, where's the wrench? Which wrench? Which size?
As opposed to handing all 44 of you an Allen wrench, right? Like, there you go, build the whole thing, right?
Well,
We're not advocating for that, but that would be funny, actually.
Right.
I would actually say there's something to be said for limiting tools and materials productively.
Yeah.
I think, again, just thinking about the body, thinking about us as the labor, us as the people who will be designing it. Frank Wilson, this is a really wonderful book on the hand, but as we set up this dichotomy between, say, the brain and the hand, his point is that the brain, it's not that the brain lives in this kind of central place. I think that notion is one that comes from old paradigms, right? There's the control center, and then there's the hand. What he said is the hand and the mind are the same thing, right? The way that you understand, and we were even, there was like a young kid in the office space the other day, and it was just like, I want something, right? Doesn't have the words yet, but the hands know how to do that. And so we can think with our bodies. We can understand things with our bodies, and we'll have to understand that as for the things that we're designing, right? We can speak with our hands. Hi, I'm Sarah. Right, and how does that translate over time? So taking the iconic image from Korb of sliding the model pieces in, how do we even just think about scaling that up? How do we think about automating some of those things? So for me, there's that precision that comes with the CAD/CAM technology. And so yes, I could cut something accurately with a jigsaw, but I would always use a CNC if I could, right? Because I'm always going to build something first in the computer. And so as we think about those sets of relationships, how they begin to play out that way. This was a Bill Mitchell diagram that I think has served me really, really well over the years. And it's just a really simple 2-axis diagram of looks versus is. And so what I also add to it is that, both in terms of money that you want to make or how much it's going to cost you to do something. And so where you don't really want to be is you don't want to be doing something that looks easy and is easy, because people aren't going to pay you to do that. It's also a really bad place to be that looks hard and is actually hard to do, right?
Yeah, that one's hilarious.
That's where we live most of the time in our profession, because every client thinks they can do what we do, right? And so that looks easy. I've lived in a house before. I've been to a restaurant before. I've done this before. I've done that before. I can do it, right? So they tend not to pay you to do those things. And it's actually really complicated what it does for us. And I jokingly say that, like, what business schools do, all their job is simply trying to find the other one that looks hard and is easy, right? You get paid really well to do that, and you get to retire. A little cynical, but I think it's also for us to manage our expectations for when we build something. Right. It's like, we're going to constantly be, and you guys will be frustrated with us. We're going to want you to be more ambitious, but not too ambitious, right? Make it more evocative, but there's no way in hell we can build that thing in a week, right? So how do we start to dial that in, and how do we start to navigate that and understand it?
And I think one of the, this is a great diagram, and adding on to the point I just mentioned earlier, that kind of looks hard is easy. I think compared to the looks easy is hard. I think when people do not embrace the limits that have been put on them is when they find themselves in the looks easy is hard category, meaning that we say to you, you have 10 days. Or 7 days, sorry, to build this. I'm
Just
giving
took
you
3
more
days
days.
away.
Yeah. Yeah.
4 of them are going to rain too.
Right, exactly. If you don't acknowledge that and you design a project that's 8 days and not 7 days, you're going to fall into the hard category that is hard. Right? And if you design it with, as Carl said, 17 different types of screws, you're going to fall in the looks hard is hard. If you ignore the fact that the material won't fit under the canopy, you're going to fall into the it looks hard, it is hard category. All right.
Yeah. What Jim said.
We're going to see, you're going to propose it. We're going to have to repeat ourselves, but I'm just, because it's in our nature. And I think you have to edit down from the hard and hard. And you have to acknowledge.
Well, and I argue too that I think, sadly, our educational system, right? If you finish early, you get ostracized as a student. They left early. It's like, you're never done. Why didn't you pull an all-nighter before? Why didn't you keep working on this thing? Sometimes there are good ideas that don't take 1 billion hours to pull something off.
I was going to say we should factor in contingency and stop talking about it being built in 7 days and talk about it being in four days. Has to be built in 4 days.
I brought a couple of images. This is from an old project that I did. This is the French dress, right? If I go back to the kimono versus French dress, this is, or Annie Albers, this is form descending on material. A priori notion of a form, and then cutting, I forget, at one point I knew how many layers of 3/4 inch AC plywood out to produce that piece of furniture, which also weighed like way too much. 19 sheets? No, I think how many layers. Oh. But the cut sheet is another thing that comes into being around the CNC router, right? Being able to have foresight, to think about how you lay the parts out, how you cut them. That's something that gets designed now. That's become a means of representation in the last few years. The reason why I include it is because this project preceded a second project for a brother of the former client, and who also wanted a plywood takeout counter. And we did it in a very different way. You can see the small biscuits of putting the thing together and spacing it out and allowing for some flexibility and some randomness. But the reason why I show it is that we developed a line of light fixtures that came out of the scraps of the material that our clients bought. So our clients paid without knowing it. We just used their scrap to cut these rings of plywood. And so if I go back and forth between them, you can see the precision of the CNC router and the fact that just stealing that material from the margins allowed us to develop something that came from the scrap, right? And so we can be mindful of that. Like, you pay for that material, whether you use it or not. And how do we start to imagine that within it? BMW looking not only at the manufacturing, but also the disassembly of the car. How do you repurpose some of those materials? How do you break it down? How do you separate out the steel from the rubber? And how do you then reuse them and put them back together again and deal with them, or the wiring or other types of things? So you guys won't be here next year, but you have to leave the instructions on how to disassemble your project for the next group, right? The next group is probably going to get a lot smarter than you guys because they have to disassemble your project.
There's 17 different types. We'll be smarter as well, so that helps.
Does it work that way? I think this is one of the last couple slides, but it's just to talk about abstraction and the way that we think about things. And so the dude on the left, there's only one of him, right? But as you move across to the right, that smiley face on the right represents everyone. And so this is the thing about, we're going to build one project and it's going to be that one example of a thing, but any good form of research needs to be able to zoom out. It needs to be able to say, well, let me take away some of those constraints, take away some of those things that make it precisely that, and how can that stand in for something else? What do we learn from this project? What do we disseminate with this? What's the narrative that comes along with this story? And I think we get to that through a level of abstraction. Be able to talk about how what we build, how this specific thing that we build, both has to satisfy the specific criteria, but it can also help us understand and help us learn how to do other things.
The scale of implications and meaning increases as you go in this direction, right? Like, that's what you're talking about. What are the implications of what you do? Is it just, we've made a blurb and this is the class and let's all go away? Or is there something more significant that we're after with the efforts we're putting forward?
And applicable to others, right? So if someone wants to build something in the co-ed courtyard, if all we learn is how to do that, it can't help anyone else. But if there are other speculations that we have, other investigations that spin off, that are cast off from the project that we build, then they can be reused, redeployed in other circumstances. So just back to the French dress and the kimono. Questions?
What, in July?
That's not the weather, that's the almanac, isn't it? It's not going to rain that week?
Oh, we're in the clear. Well, you have all 7 days.
Questions? It's too small? No?
They're all good there. They're all good there.
Okay, we want to talk about the first assignment?
Yeah.
All right, I'm done.
I think so too. I think we can tag team this.
Sure.
We'll slide into the frame, or I'll slides out. I do want to prompt though, so you're going to put that up. Oh, fabulous. Oh, and we should touch on mural too, just in case folks haven't.
Which do you want first?
We talk about work one. Do work. Yeah, work one. All right. Do you want to start? Shall I start?
Go ahead.
You're moving out of frame. All right. Whenever possible, we're going to be quite transparent and state very clearly what the assignment's about, right? What we're trying to do. So, and we're to try to do it with a 2-side limit, so 1 sheet. We're setting ourselves to those standards, not promising, but trying. Yeah. And this one, we could actually take 50% of the sheet and blow it on an image we like. Right? That's how efficient we were. So this is a project is structured so as to force you to quickly engage and immerse yourself within the topics of the studio as outlined by Carl. Rather than sit and philosophize on them for a period of time, you're going to ask to act on the things we're saying. Now, what you're going to do is to create a deployable observation shelter for a single person that encourages multiple uses or positions of the body, and there's kind of stipulations to the game as we go down. It's all about view. One of the things that, although we're still refining the culminating assignment, or not the culminating, the penultimate assignment for the class, we understand that the courtyard itself is it's, for those of you who have not been here, it's walled in glass. And so the idea of view in and view out, voyeurism, exhibitionism, these sorts of things are naturally a part of the site. And also it has a rather unique position relative to the rest of campus, kind of having these views into the quads and et cetera, et cetera. So we understand that view is going to be a part of the conversation that we have to take on just because the site gives us this. And so we're foregrounding that within this assignment. As you can see, different modes of occupation. Now, the site itself we're not asking you to deal with the courtyard. Again, you guys are scattered all over the nation, if not the world. We want you to choose a public site that you have access to that's somewhere around you, right? But it has to be public, meaning public or multiple publics, perhaps more properly, can theoretically engage this work if you were to construct it in the site you've chosen. And feel free to do so if you'd like to construct it in the course of the week, that's fine. But you don't have to. You don't have to construct it. We're going to let you simulate that construction. Obviously, you have to be responsive to the site, materials and tectonics. One of the stipulations is we've placed on there is that it has to be able to be installed and demounted by no more than 2 people. It was 1 person. We had a big debate about whether that was just mean. And those of you that ever tried to carry a sheet of plywood by yourself recognize that that, yes, indeed is mean. So a sheet of plywood is actually what dictated 2 people, I think. That's reasonable. What other things should we? We're allowing you to have some elasticity in terms of the functional programmatic considerations that you layer on. That's up to your jurisdiction, but those are not to be flippant. Those are, once again, to be reflective of the grounds for the project that you provide. In the end of the day, you're making an argument for a particular approach. And we want you to understand that the thing you're making is an argument. We frame and will frame these projects in the beginning kind of straddling between games and competitions, and we're borrowing from a number of different kind of buckets. The competition is a useful model in that you have a very small amount of space with a very few evidences in which to say a lot, right? And to create actually acts of evocation even within a very tight little envelope in terms of the visual representation, and often even in terms of the work itself. And so we're adopting that tight timetable. If we flip to the second sheet, thank you, Carl. Here we foreground at the top the key concerns, or some more key concerns in bulleted form, relative to the assembly and disassembly process, relative to the welcoming in a body, let's see, singular body, views, etc. Then we have some rules for you, right? So the rules. Now, one of the notes is we're going to declare these givens, this kind of rules and or graphic parameters on all of the assignments. These are our opportunities to focus you and actually tell you, don't think about these things, think about these things, right? And so the rules for the game in this regard, it's a space for a single occupant, not multiple. We want you to focus on a single occupant, but within 3 different modes of occupation. You have no more than 100 square feet to pull this off, and no dimension may be greater than 10 feet along a line. And they must be self-supporting and may not make permanent modifications to any existing building or structure or the earth upon which it sits. Right? The idea it's deployed and can be demounted and removed without leaving a trace. All right, so it sets lightly. And again, as you begin to cast forward your mind to what we're all going to do, so this is, you're doing it individually. This is your moment to stake a position relative to all of the things that brought you into this room. The reason we decided on an individual project to kick off the studio is we want to pay respect to the diversity of the population of students we have in this class, right? You came from very different backgrounds. You have very different interests. You're living in different parts of the country. We want you to bring that to the conversation. And so by carving out a week where you have a moment, you're not kind of coordinating with anyone else. You're not collaborating with anyone else. You're not trying to marry ideas with anyone else. This is you, right? We want you to explore the framework of the studio as we shared with you today, but do it in a way that aligns it with things that you're interested in, with your background, with your experiences. Does that make? Okay.
There's no, given the schedule, given Memorial Day, there's actually no feedback from us either.
That's right.
We don't meet, so
We're not going to enter into this. You guys are on an island. It's very much like a competition. We've set up the brief, and we'll see you again at the final submission. Like, that's it.
We're issuing 2 on the 30th.
Yeah, exactly. Work 2 will be issued on the day you hand this one in. So it'll be like a baton passing will occur. Yes, there's a question, and I'll repeat it for those of you looking on YouTube.
Like, it can't exceed, like, basically a 10-foot by 10-foot cube, or
No.
literally no part of it?
We have not declared a cube,
Okay.
and we purposely not declared a cube. We are saying that, and that you don't add to the rules. 100 square feet, no aspect of the proposal may exceed 10 feet in any direction, any single direction. We wrestled with those words a little bit. I think we went back and forth 2 or 3 times until we resolved on that. Because we didn't want, the reason I was on you about the cube is we purposely didn't want to infer a geometric bias. That was really intentional and very important for us. The dissemination, again, we're limiting you, and this is intentional. We want you to be very thoughtful about the evidences you put on the sheet. And so one primary image. In many respects, that image will tell the entire story. Many of you're doing your job well if you could actually just submit that image, drop mic, and leave. Right? And I would set that up as the standard for you. Like, you could just, that image and maybe the title, you have to give the work a name. Sorry. I would advise you not to use 72-point font to register that name, but that's up to you, I suppose. No, there's a template.
There's a template.
Oh, thank God, yeah. Though we're not going to leave that to chance. So there's a template.
Do not
But you could
deviate
do not deviate from the
from the
template.
template.
Don't taunt happy fun template. So the one image and then a title, and you should be able. That's the whole story. But we are giving you some collateral information that you can include as well. And that's 2 or 3 secondary images or drawings or diagrams. I would encourage you to leverage those to talk about the grounding of the work, or what makes the work meaningful, or how the work attaches itself to the kind of context. Broadly, this is where you could talk about some of the processes of fabrication or putting it together, or how it leads to the views, et cetera, et cetera. So you pick up these strands and attach them back to your interests. The 3 to 5 sentence description or argument, again, we couldn't agree on which of it, whether it was a description or an argument. So we put both words in there and said, you pick whether it's an argument or a description. And then other annotations if you see fit to add those. There is a template. You have access to this. You will use the template. Those that don't use the template will print out your work and burn it ceremoniously. And we will broadcast the burning of your work on YouTube. And we will not save the ashes. Do you want to, are you... she's templating. Here's the template. Kristen, you want to talk about the template?
Oh. Digitally, thanks, yep. Digitally, we'll be viewing everything as spreads. So when you're exporting, you're going to export as 2-page spreads, right? And that becomes a 16 by 10 singular image that we'll view digitally. But we set up the template in a book format, so as pages. So then, as the kind of final documentation, we can move that into a book relatively quickly. The only thing that really dictates the format is the text. So you can see the text exists on the master page, right? And then which means that every time you create a new page, that text will automatically generate, and you can unlock that. And then there's also some example pages, one that sort of describes the text, and then some sample pages. I'll just go through a quick preview here. Of different ways that you might set up within that document. So the text sort of stays in the same within these 4 columns, but images can move wherever you want with the text. And this should be familiar. There's several of you that have taken my VisCom course, and we did something similar to this. When I talk about setting up spreads with students, the text I almost think about, if you think about a spread as a floor plan, I think about the way that the text is set up as the staircase. It's the thing that kind of guides you between each page, and the photos or the imagery can move wherever they want, as long as the text has some consistency. So that's my helpful advice. So yeah, if there's questions about the InDesign setup, you can direct them my way. That's that.
Yeah. No questions on this assignment or the template? All right, just a quick word about the mural site. Do you want to flip to it? So unfortunately, when I signed up for Mural 2 years ago, I didn't realize I only got one shot at this. And so I made files all over the place. So sorry, this is my hot mess. But if you go down, Carl, how do you go down? Damn it. How do you go down with you? How do you got your weirdo mouse? Can you go down till it says Crit-Prax? Critical Practice Summer, blada, 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 2019. There you are. Carl hasn't joined it yet. Could you join it, please? Please? Jeez. He's joined it. So if you look in here, now one of the things you can do is there is an option if you click on the summer, Critical Practice Summer. He has a weird game mouse or something. I don't know what's happening. You like to play games? Is that what's happening? You're a gamer? So anyways, you see how the star icon pops up there? If you click that star, that will put it to the top of my hot mess every time, right? So I would encourage you to just star the folder. Within here, we have a library of visual precedents that we provided. Hi, Carl. Look, sticky notes are great. Check that out. Let's go ahead and, oh, damn it. Your mouse is freaking me out. All right. So a glossary of visual precedents. Hey, Megan, how are you? Megan's in here. Who else is in here? Hey, Kayla. So within this, you'll notice that there is a graphic minimalism is one of the things you'll note. This is not actually a move of style. This is a move of, in the same way that your work should start from the gravitational pull of what the site is doing and the parameters given to you by the site, and gradually from that drive complexity, right? So the fact that we build this within a week is something that will naturally drive a certain complexity of the project. There'll be moves we make that are in service of, we got a week to pull this thing off. There are moves that we'll make relative to the budget. There'll be moves that we make to these other things. In the same way, graphically, what we're advocating for here is that you are mindful of, if you spend graphic resources all of the time, when you really have to make a statement, there's nothing in reserve for you. Whereas if you can express very clearly using a few graphic variables and understand that when I say graphic variables, I'm talking about things such as color or opacity or, right? These sorts of things, repetition, fundamentals. You leave yourself no room if you don't save anything in the chamber. And so the idea would be if you can express something using simple line work, then you would do so. Because then it allows you to either layer additional information onto that graphic element as you continue, because chances are your understanding of your proposal as you state right now is not as great as it will be 3 days from now, which will not be as great as it will be 10 days from now. And so if you're generating content 3 days from now and you deploy every graphic variable where it's full saturation and all the colors you can possibly think of, et cetera, as your understanding of that project advances 7 days from that moment forward, it's very difficult for you to layer that information onto that. Does that make sense? So that's where you see this kind of selection. It doesn't mean that we're not advocates about glossy, wonderful imagery. Absolutely. But we're urging you to understand the kind of the beauty and the clarity of graphic minimalism and how it can be a strategic ally within your work. Does that make sense?
Scott, real quick.
Yeah.
As I'm looking at the screen, I'm seeing, Roberto and others kind of, and Megan kind of scrolling around. It reminds me to note, I'm seeing also a lot of the students have gone to switch out to the new laptops we have. If you're a student who has an L2 laptop, or if you're a student who has a stylus or a iPad or something with a stylus, you can actually draw together on the mural. So you can sketch together on the mural space, even if you're on different continents, and kind of work out ideas together as you draw, which is pretty effective.
Yeah, these
way of
toolbars here
working.
on the side are wonderful allies. And what I would encourage you to do, so what's going to occur if we go back here, work one. So what we've done is we've created basically boards for our final reviews. Do not, until your final work is ready, put anything into those spaces. What you do is you either create your own mural site, and your EDU email gives you access to create your own mural space, so you can go off and do that. If you want, you can use this Critical Practice Summer 2019 folder, and you can add some content here. Hold on, before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and star these, because then otherwise these will never be found again. Once anyone adds it, then this will be as buried as my normal, right? It'd be terrible. But we've reserved this site for the reviews, but we encourage you to use murals. The first project's individual. It might be a great opportunity for you to be able to understand how to utilize this tool. But then as we go to work two, you're going to find it essential for sharing work with one another across great distances. It's intuitive. You'll find you get into it. It's incredibly simple to use. Any questions about it? There won't be. Good Lord, it's easy. Don't close it. I won't close it. That's what you're saying? Oh, the schedule's here. That. Yeah. See, we were very busy planning this class, right? This looks very official, because it was. So you can see where we fit here, right? Starting the projects gradually. We're not going to flash this up too much, because we don't want to give away all our secrets. Sorry? Oh, zoom out. There it is. Now you can't read it. But what we want to note here is how this work builds upon everything that precedes it, and how as we increase the team and the team structure, we're also increasing the expectations of deliverables and the time we're allocating. So this work kind of builds steam. That's that whole notion embedded within the title, how we started the conversation. Anything else we want to talk about with this one? Can't think of anything. One of the pieces we're going to ask you to fill in will be a self-evaluation. I would say that self-evaluation is right now, it's already posted on Canvas, right?
If you go into the Canvas.
No, that's mural. There I am. Thank God. Is it the evaluation, the self-evaluation?
So they're saying they've lost audio.
Have they? Still? I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Is it not here?
You can't take the quiz.
Yeah, you're not allowed to.
For them, it looks like the quiz.
Yeah, you can't get it. You're not entitled to take the quiz, Carl.
If you go back, Carl, and do student view.
Just do a preview.
Yeah. So that you're reading, but there's an assessment tool that we're also going to ask you to do, which is not embedded in this, right?
It is embedded in that.
Oh, it is.
Skill serve.
There it is. Fantastic. Number 7. So if you clicked on number 7, that would give you the opportunity to evaluate your. Can you click on number 7? Are you allowed, Carl? Look at you go, right? So this is like, we go back up to project management. Oh my God, I'm getting a headache. All right. So project management, we're asking you, are you someone, where would you rank yourself in project management in terms of like proficiency? Do you have trouble remembering to eat? Or does Warren Buffett call you for advice, right? And number 4, the meaty middle, is somewhere like you're in love with Google Calendar. But you can go down to rhetorical gifts. My arguments confuse even me. I routinely convince my friends to eat sushi, which is right in the middle ground there. And I can improve the existence of God in 5 words. Actually, I changed that one to something better, but that's all right. Let's see. Construction wizardry, I injured myself with sandpaper is at one end. And my dovetail joints are better than yours. So all the way down, you can evaluate yourself here. Obviously, one of the things we're going to do is begin, as we create teams for the next assignment, we are going to pair unlike skills in a team. And one of the things I found having used this survey before is it allows team members to begin to declare a role within the project. And so within each team, we hopefully have 11 folks in the room that will admit to geeking out to Excel and Google Calendars a little bit. So we have 11 project manager kind of folk, people that got really excited when we showed that all right, the Gantt chart up there. That was your language right there. If you're those people, you're going to be some of the most popular people in the class. I'm just telling you that. But we're going to sprinkle you right around. In the same token, people that cannot injure themselves with sandpaper, right? Those are going to be very valuable as well. What is it now? There's one in there about like rocking 2 or 3 monitors or something as well. So be honest about this. All right, be honest about this assessment. Don't, like, no one's going to view and critique you if you, like, do actually injure yourself with sandpaper.
There's value
Yeah.
to be on both sides of it.
Yeah, absolutely. But what will happen then is on your team, someone will take on the role and say, I'm going to function as kind of a project manager. And we've talked about, and I've done this in studios before, where I just ask each team of 4 people to declare someone that is a parliamentarian whose job it is to make the argument, to refine the argument. And their job, someone else is a documentarian, and their job is the kind of visual language deployed and making sure that's consistent. I just find that teams function a little better when everyone overlaps, but you also have a productive region that's kind of your own, where you're taking the lead. And so please be honest with the survey. Take it very seriously, despite the fact the little humor embedded within it. All right. I can open a new file. All right. No questions about that, right? See? Look how organized this is. There must be a project manager on our team. Not it. Thank you, Kristen. Fabulous, yeah. All right.
I'm the multiple monitor guy.
That's you. That's you. I'm not injure myself with sandpaper. That's my role. All right, what do you guys have for us? What do you guys have for us? That's it, right? We just have the shadow puppets that we were going to do, and that's it. We're done. Yeah, Carl was going to do an interpretive dance and close the studio out, so I'll give way. Well, there are no questions. There's a question. There are 2. Fantastic.
Next Thursday, when we get the new assignment, are we going to also have our team members?
Yes. The question would be, there's going to be a delay. right? Because what's going to happen? So the question was, next Thursday when you get the new assignment, will you also know who your teammates are, right? So that you can actually execute that assignment that we just gave you. The answer is yes. But what we have to do is we have to get in a room together and review the 44 submissions. We have to review them not just for their quality and how we might assess them as a part of the grading protocol, but also to understand what you're interested in, right? So this really is a kind of a biographical moment for you where you're saying, these are things that I'm really interested in talking about as a scholar in architecture, right? And so we're going to assess that and say, okay, here are 7 people that are all interested in this kind of realm, right? And we're going to use the mural probably to begin to organize people like that, and form teams. We're going to then cross-reference it. Actually, what we'll probably do is like have 8 people that are interested in the same conversation, and then we'll reference the survey to say, okay, there's one project manager here. What do we do, right?
Yeah, and you'll notice in the Canvas site there, the groups are already set up, like how the groups are going to be set up are in there. We just haven't put anybody in them. And so we'll sort you into those and you're going to see who you're.
Yeah. So that's Thursday, because Monday is Memorial Day, and so I assume everyone will eat brats, or I don't know what you're going to do, whatever you're going to do.
They submit on Thursday, but on the following Monday we give them?
Thursday, we've scheduled a time where we have, like, they submit, I think it's like a 9 a.m. submission, or,
Right, it's at 8 a.m.
yeah, you
by
guys
8
submit in the
a.m.
morning.
Thursday.
And then we have that day where we're going to review the work, and Carl doesn't know it, but I've already scheduled 3 hours in his schedule to review these things. And so the 4 of us will get together, we'll review these things. He'll be in Korea, he's reviewing them remotely or just through his vibes. And then we will put you into teams.
But just to clarify, there's only a submission on Thursday, and then
Yeah.
you'll receive your instructions for work 2, where we won't be
Yeah.
meeting via Zoom.
No, that's
Or
our private
mural.
time to talk about your work candidly. Yeah,
Exactly.
executive time. Chris, did you have a question as well?
I was gonna ask if we're presenting work one, but I think
You're presenting through the board, and that's again intentional, is we want, just like a competition, the visual evidence is all you have to say. Right? And the title and the 3 sentences. Yes, which are all visually registered. Yes.
So there's a submittal on mural for that? Can you clarify on like how we actually do that? We're submitting on that work one issue?
Yeah, so mural, there is a submission. If you go under right there, you click on it. If the image is saved, you can just upload an image right to that board. So if the image is saved on your desktop anywhere as a PDF or a JPEG, bless you, you can upload, you can bring it right into there. Go to the little picture icon, no, in the corner. See the little mountain with a sun? Down. Look at the mountain, there, images.
So we'll have 44.
Upload images.
44 spreads on there, yeah.
On the one, right, you'll have 44 spreads on that, and just arrange them in a grid. So the first person on there, go to the top corner, and then go down and over.
And what you guys get a sense of, if you haven't used it before, is like you can keep zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. So it's nice you can get a comprehensive view, but then you don't lose detail as you move in.
You can put PDFs on there too, though.
Yes.
And then, so when you said the spread thing, like, so when it.
One image.
Viewer, they'll really.
You'll have to export as spreads.
Okay.
Right, so you're going to have, it should be 160
That'll be what you upload.
when you export it.
That will be what you upload, what he's just showing you.
Right, no, I just tried to print.
No, when you print or you export, sorry, out of InDesign, that's an option to do it as a spread or as a page.
Part of the, again, one of the other thoughts behind this really quick 1-week assignment, aside from allowing you to register your interests, et cetera, as we've already described, is to give us a very quick tutorial on all of these mechanisms that we'll be deploying for the entire summer with one another, right? And so these questions are expected and wanted, so thank you. Other questions? Yes? The question was, what software was the template in, or is and it's InDesign. It's an InDesign file.
So if we don't have that software, I don't know if I'm gonna be the only student that does not have an LTU laptop. Okay.
You should be able to still get this software on your laptop, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
As an LTU student, I'm sorry.
You-
As an go ahead.
Yeah, you can, with Creative Cloud, you can download it, and there's an option to log in with an enterprise ID. And so when you get to that point, you'll actually log in with your LTU email and the same login that you log into Canvas, and that will give you access to the program. So you can download the entire Adobe suite with that login. It's pretty great. And in addition to that, I should also mention, if you're not familiar with InDesign, because we are requiring that that everything happen in this InDesign template, also with your LTU login, you have access to lynda.com, and I linked at the very back of the syllabus. There's an appendix, and I linked to the lynda.com InDesign tutorial. So you have free access with your L2U login to that as well, and all other software tutorials through lynda.com. So take some time to get familiar or even brush up on InDesign if it's been a while since you've used it.
Great. Good questions. Are there questions here? No, thanks. That's what I'm seeing on the chat. Hold on, let me scroll down. Nope, just lots of thanks. Supporting each other. That's what's happening on the chat. Fantastic work, everybody. What else?
I was going to mention, I believe that for the assignment sheet, I had uploads to both Mural and to Canvas.
Yes, and that's as it should be.
Yeah, so Mural will be the place that will post things for reviews. Canvas will be the place where you'll submit your final work for grading. So sometimes there'll be for work one, that'll be the same work, right? I would say occasionally we'll have reviews, perhaps there'll be some changes, and then you'll submit your final work to Canvas for that final grading. So for work one, those are one and the same.
Yeah, and I didn't, so for the other works, we've established the review page. It doesn't mean it's just final review. So we'll be jumping on there where we have our Monday session with you. That will be where we meet you, at least visually. That's where we'll like hang out together to look at the work. And so you can obviously have Rain to use that as you see fit. Just understand that everyone else can edit those documents as well. All right, other questions? I don't know how Jim's managed to be off camera the entire time. Well done. All right. Well, I think that's it. Do you have any like words of wisdom, Carl? You close this thing down?
Super excited and looking forward to this.
Oh, I see. So this is the moment where we insert the boilerplate on how excited we are, and yes, and thank you for coming.
We're excited to kick this off.
Don't forget to tip your servers on the way out, and leave us a comment card. We look forward to working with y'all. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's it.